Hi, and welcome to the Biomass Magazine podcast. We are here live from the International Biomass Conference and Expo trade show floor. And I am here with Dylan Chase, Manager of Public Relations at the RNG Coalition. Dylan, welcome to the podcast. So glad to have you here.
Thank you very much. You got a great event going on so far. Having a nice time meeting a lot of smart and good-looking people around here. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We're so glad you're here. So I think maybe we'll start with having you tell us a little bit about RNG Coalition and its members and what you guys do there.
Yeah, absolutely. So RNG Coalition, for those that don't know, is a leading nonprofit trade group for the renewable natural gas industry. We represent the entire RNG value chain. If there is something you could conceive of that's part of capturing methane and outputting RNG, we probably have a member who's involved in that, and that goes from your RNG developers down to universities who are doing research around RNG, law firms who are involved in transactions or just have clients in the RNG space, and then of course your engineering and procurement firms that put all the building blocks together. We have over 400 members now. We've grown tremendously as the industry has grown over the years. When we were founded in 2011, there were around 30 RNG facilities operating in North America, and we've grown about tenfold as an industry since then to over 300 facilities at present. So yeah, really, we are a policy platform. I, as you mentioned, work in public relations, so I'm focused on how we tell our story best in the media and how we educate the public, partly through support from people like yourself and platforms like these. But largely, our organization is about going to state capitals, going to the federal government and advocating for the interests of our members, which mainly concern capturing every molecule of methane that we can and turning it into a resource that displaces fossil natural gas.
So I think that's a good segue.
Mhm.
Why don't we, for anyone who's watching this that who doesn't know, let's go back to the basics. Renewable natural gas. What is the difference between RNG and just regular natural gas?
Sure. So regular natural gas, is buried deep in the ground and it
Mhm.
needs to generally be drilled or fracked to be extracted. It's buried way down deep from long ago. And really, I would argue, doesn't have too much business being on the surface of the earth. Renewable natural gas, however, comes from your waste. So your trash, your emissions tied to your dairy consumption. If you like milk, you like yogurt, you like cheese, you have a hand in producing methane emissions. It's a nasty fact, but the reality is that cows produce excrement just like all of us, and that excrement creates methane emissions, which, if left unabated, have a very deleterious impact on our environment, much more so than even CO2 emissions, like those that come out of your tailpipe
Yeah.
or out of smokestacks, in which people, often think about first when they think about GHG emissions. Methane emissions that come, for instance, from dairy farms or from landfills are horribly catastrophic for our environment. And that's a huge reason why you've seen such support for RNG in recent years. What we do really is capture those emissions either through landfill gas systems or anaerobic digesters on farms, which, for those that don't know, it's basically kind of like a giant stomach where you put all the manure into a tank, which doesn't have any oxygen. And, chemistry and magic goes to work and biogas is produced. And that's basically raw methane from that feedstock. And with RNG, basically, we upgrade or clean and condition that raw biogas into RNG, which is basically chemically identical with fossil natural gas, like that we need to drill deep into the ground and extract. Now, so we have a double emissions reduction benefit. One, we're reducing emissions, at a landfill or at a dairy farm largely, but also at wastewater treatment sites, also at food waste diversion facilities, woody biomass, a number of different feedstocks. Uh, so we're addressing emissions there, but secondly, we're also reducing emissions in our gas system where we typically use fossil natural gas. We're pushing more of that gas out of the system all the time and replacing it with something that was already here on Earth, in our atmosphere.
Right. Very well explained. So why don't we move to the state of the RNG industry and, kind of its growth trajectory. I know it's experienced some pretty incredible growth over the next few years, and it doesn't look to be slowing down too much.
Not at all. Not at all. Yeah, as I mentioned, we've experienced tenfold growth since 2011, which is cause to celebrate. That was a big occasion for us, but we are expected to continue that growth rate in coming years as more and more industries, figure out a way to procure RNG, and we'll get into like maybe what the drivers of our growth is going to be in the future. Historically, a lot of our growth has come from the compressed natural gas vehicles market. So we're talking about big trucks essentially that, maybe used to run on diesel that are converted or created to have a more carbon alternative to a diesel engine or what have you. That's really driven the bulk of our growth historically. We still expect to expand there in coming years. Cummins is producing a new RNG engine a lot of people are excited about that's going to create some new vehicles that can run on renewable natural gas. We've been very successful, in penetrating that market, especially in California, where RNG represents the overwhelming majority of all, fuel used by compressed natural gas vehicles. Now, I personally joined the coalition a year ago and at a very interesting time in the industry because there are these sort of existential questions about the future. Like, okay, we've had a huge success. What now? And that's really exciting from my vantage point because there's really no shortage of places where we're going to see demand. We're seeing it in the utility space, partly through clean heat standards, for instance, which request that utilities blend a certain amount of RNG into their supply. We're also seeing it in the voluntary space. For instance, last year we saw AstraZeneca, which is big is probably actually an understatement, a massive pharmaceutical conglomerate based in the UK. They stroked a deal with Vanguard Renewables, one of our members, to procure RNG. I believe all of its U.S. campuses. I believe that was noted as the largest voluntary RNG deal that we'd seen. But also, University of California is a voluntary RNG buyer. So when we say voluntary, what we're really talking about is corporations like AstraZeneca stepping up and saying, okay, we need to do everything that we can to defossilize all of our energy use. And this is a really clear hand solution. Maybe it doesn't address everything about our footprint, but it's an obvious solution. So yeah, as mentioned, utility space, the voluntary space, and hard to decarbonize sectors that need molecules to burn to make their products are all areas we're going to see tremendous growth. Our next 10x growth trajectory, essentially.
Right. Okay, so those are obviously drivers. What are the other drivers? The RFS, of course.
Yeah.
The IRA.
So policy drivers,
Yep.
And that's germane because we're actually going to be talking about that tomorrow. We've got a panel.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I'm
Good
looking forward
segue.
to with a couple of our members actually. Yeah, historically the RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standard, is the federal biofuel blending program. It essentially mandates how much renewable fuel has to be blended into the existing transportation fuel supply. It's been a huge driver behind our industry, and as I mentioned, it's helped, particularly with the transportation market. It's a key reason why we've had all the growth that we have had. Also, the low carbon fuel standard. Yeah, state level. It's perfect that we're meeting today because today we are seeing New Mexico's governor actually sign their clean fuel standard into existence, which is very exciting for us. It's the first state outside of the West Coast. Maybe the New Mexico is the West Coast, it's the general West, but outside of the particular West Coast enact a clean fuel standard. We expect we're going to see lots more, given some policy momentum that we see in different states. Don't want to place bets on which states are going to get them across the finish line, but certainly we applaud New Mexico for recognizing that, hey, we're driving vehicles here and some of them are very big and they run on diesel.
Yeah.
What can we do to to incentivize getting those vehicles away from using very dense fossil fuels, I should say. Aside from that, aside from clean fuel standard programs, which California has the largest, I should also mention, We also have clean heat standards, which I previously mentioned. So that's at the utility level.
Yep.
Renewable gas standards, different programs that try and work in lower carbon alternatives into the energy supply. And then you mentioned the IRA. So
Yeah.
this was really a kind of sea change for our industry. I was a journalist before I came to the coalition.
Okay.
Yep, I worked at S&P Global and Argus Media, and was very much in like the price reporting space. So a very nerdy section of the reporting world, but
Oh, I
yeah,
like
yeah, absolutely, it's fun to dig into stuff, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
And from there, I really started reporting on the IRA, and actually really stoked my interest in RNG, being one of the lead beneficiaries of the IRA. It was a kind of a heady time. I remember when that was signed into law, and it seemed like all these industries were going to benefit.
Yeah.
And as a gas reporter at the time, I found my way into writing about RNG, which is, in terms of the gas industry, it was really the growth space due to the IRA. There are a few different components of the IRA, for those that don't know, that are going to benefit our industry.
Okay.
And that's front and center for us right now. Absolutely, is how at the federal level we're going to see, our members benefit, and also our environment benefit from more RNG supplies.
Very exciting. Well, you might have covered some of them, but let's move on to highlights of the past year.
Sure. So the biggest one for us, it's tough because sometimes we look back on a year and there's all these transactions or deals that get talked about. For us, we represent such a large portion, almost the entirety of the RNG value chain, that
Yeah.
it's oftentimes we're talking about like one member buying another. So it's
Yes.
like, I don't know, it's relative to how much I want to
Yeah.
highlight what one company has done versus another. The
Totally
biggest thing for
understand.
us though was the 300 facilities, passing that threshold. Ensuring that we've grown 10x from when we started. I think we really can't celebrate that enough.
Yeah.
We also have just seen a lot of continued advocacy with the federal government on IRA. And also the RFS probably is a huge lead story from last year. We got a very favorable rulemaking, which is called the SET rule, which
Yep.
essentially established volumes for 2023, 2024, 2025. As a comms guy, I can't remember exactly how many gallons or exactly how much of an increase, but it was very substantial in terms of cellulosic biofuel volumes that were going to be mandated. And it also gave our industry a lot of certainty because for the first time we were getting a multi-year rulemaking.
Yes.
So that was a huge relief for many of our members, and certainly for our advocacy warriors at RNG Coalition. And yeah, we applaud EPA for showing the leadership that they did, and look forward to continue supplying more and more volumes of RNG to those RFS markets in coming years.
No doubt. Okay, so those are highlights. What about what are the challenges that you face right now?
Well, like I said, as a comms guy, I'm thinking front and center all the time of
Yeah.
public attitudes and understanding,
Mhm.
and challenges
Yeah.
around RNG. I think you saw so much interest in RNG rising in recent years with big policy developments, but also, giant transactions that happened
Mhm.
that put our industry on the front page of newspapers, really.
Yeah.
And that's obviously led to a bit of I don't want to say backlash, but something just we have to face in terms of a challenge where you've got in my field, reporters who have never written about RNG, writing about it for the first time, oftentimes, and it's my responsibility to work with those reporters and make sure that they're covering our industry in a fair way.
Yeah.
We're very complicated as an industry because we exist kind of at the intersection of a number of industries, right? So, for instance, if you have an issue with dairy farms, which some people do,
Yeah.
right? Like some people don't eat dairy products and they
Right.
just don't like that there are dairy farms. They might be inclined to throw us out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that we see in California currently, where we're working, to make sure that the LCFS is managed and implemented in the most climate smart way. And one of the hugest challenges we have is that we have a lot of, I don't want to say opponents because I don't think of them as opponents. I'll just say advocates who have a different perspective, who allege that RNG is not as climate smart as it is because they kind of have this sense that maybe we can do away with dairy farms altogether,
Mm.
and that if we're helping dairy farms, that somehow we're responsible for their emissions, which does not make sense on its head because we're actually reducing emissions from those dairy farms.
Right.
So, regardless of what your view is, if you've got a brother, sister, friend, cousin who eats yogurt or drinks milk, as I mentioned before, you're you're not that far away from the creation of those emissions. We
Right.
help address those, and part of our mission is just to constantly reinforce that. And that's tough, right? Because it's like a pragmatist story. We're not really. It's difficult because you're dealing with people who have ideals that may not be entirely practicable, and they may not have viable alternatives. And it can sound cynical to those ears, I think, sometimes when we communicate our story.
Yeah.
So for me personally, it's about getting those people to see that we share the same values of cleaning up our environment. We may have different ideas about how to do that, but ultimately, we just need to communicate and look at the facts and data and try and have more rapport. And that's quite literally my job working with reporters, and making sure that we're on the same page and can come to consensus and at least make sure that our industry is reported on fairly,
Yeah.
even if it's, not a glowing story or it features some experts that are, known opponents of RNG, making sure that we have a chance to present the facts that are on the record. As I mentioned, we have a number of universities that are a part of our coalition. Those include some of the most burnished names in all of academia and around the world. There's no shortage of research from those universities, from EPA and IEA internationally. I could point to a number of examples in the EU that speak to our credibility. So I think the next phase really is like we've had this tremendous growth phase. We've saturated, a few markets with our commodity, but now as we continue to grow, it's about getting that public buy-in.
Right.
That public buy-in is going to lead, in my opinion, to more corporations stepping up to do the right thing and making voluntary purchases, right? So
Yeah.
we need to make sure that people understand that at the kitchen table,
Mhm.
as much as we might be just a small corner of the overall energy mix. It's important that we understand that, or that we get young people and families to understand that we're a positive thing for the environment. And that means that the companies that they buy products from or services from are going to be a little more inclined to stepping forward and using us for what we can provide in terms of defossilizing their energy use.
Very well said,
That
Dylan.
was a total mouthful, but you
No,
can tell
I
that
loved
one's
it.
like I'm a jack in the box popping out with when we talk about challenges for our industry.
It was very well said. You're good at your job.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, okay, last question.
Mhm.
Forward looking, what's in store for 2024?
So 2024, as mentioned, looking at some challenges, we're still very closely engaged on the California LCFS rulemaking and perceptions around that rulemaking. Recently I've seen a number of media stories talking about the link between LCFS programs and higher gasoline prices. Those arguments don't have a lot of substance. Bates White uh, recently found and stated in no uncertain terms that there isn't a direct link from historic data between LCFS programs and higher gasoline prices. The California Energy Commission has also, done research on this and has found a very, not a significant impact, with more than 50% of the gasoline price still being from crude oil and then, profit margins. So in terms of, addressing public sentiment personally, I'm focused on that. As mentioned before, the IRA remains extremely critical to us. We recently got a really favorable, not a rulemaking, but a technical correction that was part of a rulemaking. So for those that don't know, the IRA introduced investment. It introduced the eligibility of RNG for certain investment tax credits that historically have supported clean energy. And those start at, I believe, a 6% baseline, and then it can go up to 30%. And then there's some 10% kickers that Congress outlined for RNG projects. We had a bit of an issue where, the federal agencies came out in November and suddenly reinterpreted congressional statute a little bit and essentially said that, well, these biogas projects are still going to be eligible, but the cleaning and conditioning equipment that takes to RNG won't be. And the rationale behind that we can sidestep because it might get a little boring and legalistic. But the good news is that, our members stepped up, our advocates stepped up and, petitioned federal agencies to make sure this was amended and that we ultimately see those tax credits go through as Congress intended. And luckily, we recently got a technical correction as part of that process that said, in again legalistic terms, that actually we're going to see cleaning and conditioning equipment covered under those credits. So it's the
Right.
nitty gritty. That's what we're
Yeah.
involved in. Especially as these new policies are rolled out. There's no shortage of places where RNG Coalition is looking to make an impact. But it's important,
It
right? Like
is.
these policies create the platform through which our entire energy system is going to be changed. And I think it's important for every listener, of this podcast, and certainly, every tax-paying citizen to be aware of how their energy system is changing, and as it relates to us, how RNG can contribute to defossilization.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dylan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I hope our listeners or watchers learned a lot. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. It's really important what you're doing as well to provide a platform for groups like RNG Coalition to spread the good word of again what we can do to clean up our environment and clean up our energy system. So thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. And thanks for tuning in to the Biomass Magazine podcast. Until next time.